Welcome to the deep dive. Heat treatment. It's one of those things that every metal additive manufacturing professional has to deal with. And it really boils down to one question. Should we handle this in-house or are we better off outsourcing?
Yeah, it's a tough question, and one that the article you shared from Inside Metal Additive Manufacturing called Outsourcing Heat Treatment in Metal AM Smart Strategy or Hidden Risk
hmm
really digs into.
For sure. It does. And I think for our listeners out there, people making these decisions every day, we should probably start with why this is such a critical decision in the first place.
Yeah, heat treatment is often, I think, kind of overlooked in the whole additive manufacturing process, but it's
Yeah.
really the key to getting a good part. It's not just about heating the part up. We're talking about really changing the microstructure of the material to get the properties that we want.
So it's not just like an afterthought at the end.
No, not at all. I mean, think about it this way. You can 3D print the most complex part in the world, but if you don't heat treat it correctly, it's useless. You're not going to get the strength, the durability, or the performance that you need.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the specific processes that are involved in heat treatment. The article mentioned a few.
Right. So for metal AM, the main ones we're talking about are stress relieving, annealing, solution treatment, and aging, or STA. And then hot isostatic pressing, which most people just call HIP. And each one is kind of targeting a different property of the material.
Let's start with stress relieving. What's the point of that?
Well, when you're printing a part, right, there's a lot of internal stresses that build up in the material. It's like having all these tiny little ropes inside pulling in different directions. And what stress relieving does is it kind of releases all those stresses so the part doesn't warp or crack later on.
So it's about making sure the part is stable
Yeah.
and preventing those hidden weaknesses from, causing problems down the road.
Yeah, exactly. Then there's annealing. Annealing is all about making the material more ductile. So instead of being brittle and shattering like glass, it can bend and flex without breaking. This is super important for parts that need to withstand impact or, any kind of deformation.
And annealing is often used to prepare a part for further processing too.
Yeah, yeah. It can make machining or forming easier because it reduces the hardness of the material and makes it more machinable. Now, if you want to boost the strength and fatigue resistance of the part, that's where solution treatment and aging or STA really come in.
So that's where we're fine-tuning those mechanical properties.
Exactly. So you heat the part up to a really specific temperature. It's almost like you're dissolving those strengthening elements into the material. And then you carefully cool it down to allow them to precipitate back out, but in a very controlled way. And what this does is it creates a fine dispersion of these tiny strengthening particles, which makes the part much stronger and especially resistant to repeated stresses.
So it's like you're engineering those tiny particles within the material itself to get the performance you want.
Right on. And finally, we have hot isostatic pressing, or HIP. This is the big one. If you need to get rid of porosity and get the absolute maximum density in your part, it's kind of like taking a sponge and squeezing all the air pockets out of it, but under tremendous pressure and heat. What you end up with is a super dense and strong part, which is perfect for really demanding applications.
So these heat treatment processes, they're really not just like optional extras. They're essential for turning a 3D printed part into something that can actually function in the real world.
Mm.
But then the big question is, do we invest in all the equipment and the expertise to do this in-house, or do we hand it off to somebody else? And the article makes a pretty strong case for outsourcing, which I think a lot of our listeners are probably considering already.
Yeah, I mean, it's understandable why people are looking at outsourcing. Instead of making this huge investment in equipment and expertise, you can just tap into somebody else's capabilities.
And especially in such a fast-paced industry as this one. I mean, it's got to be tempting, right? I mean, the article talked about potential cost savings, the ability to scale production up or down as you need to, and working with providers who already have certifications like Entity TCAP and AS9100,
Hmm.
which, as our listeners know, are really important in regulated industries.
Yeah, and you can't forget about the reduction in operational complexity either. I mean, outsourcing it frees you up from all the hassles of finding and training specialized staff, maintaining equipment, keeping up with regulations. It can be a huge relief for companies that are already stretched thin.
So there are a lot of advantages to outsourcing. But like with anything, there's got to be another side to this coin, right?
Mhm.
What are some of the downsides that the article mentions?
Yeah, there are definitely some things to consider. One of the biggest ones is that you might have to deal with longer lead times. When you outsource, you're at the mercy of the provider's schedule,
Right.
and you have to factor in transportation time too. So if you're working on tight deadlines, which, let's face it, is pretty common in this industry, it could be a problem.
And then there's the issue of control, too. When you outsource, You're handing over a really critical part of your process. So you have to be able to trust that the provider understands your specific requirements, that they're going to meet your quality standards, and that they're going to handle your parts carefully.
Right. And there's also the issue of intellectual property. If you're working with innovative designs or proprietary processes, outsourcing can be risky. You really need to be sure that the provider has good security protocols and that they're committed to confidentiality.
These are all valid concerns, especially for companies that are working with cutting-edge technology and sensitive information. And the article also mentions that while outsourcing might seem cheaper at first, it can actually end up being more expensive if you're only doing small production runs.
Yeah, that's a really important point. The economics of outsourcing really depend on your volume. If you're only heat treating parts occasionally, the cost per part could be a lot higher than if you had your own in-house setup.
Yeah.
So it's all about finding that sweet spot where the volume of work justifies the investment in your own capabilities.
So it's not a simple, in-house or outsourced decision. There are a lot of different factors to consider. And what makes sense for one company might not be the best fit for another. And the article lays out several key factors to think about when making this decision. And I think this is where things get really interesting for our listeners.
Definitely. And we'll jump into those key factors right after this.
All right, so we've talked about why heat treatment is so important in metal AM, and we've touched on the good and the bad of outsourcing. But for our listeners out there who are trying to decide what to do, what are some of the key factors they should be thinking about?
Well, I think the first thing you need to consider is your production volume and consistency. Are you heat treating parts all the time, or is it more of a once in a while kind of thing?
Right. So if you have a really steady flow of parts that need to be heat treated, that might make it worth investing in an in-house setup.
Exactly. If you're constantly sending parts out for heat treatment, you might find that it ends up being more expensive and a bigger hassle than just doing it yourself. But on the other hand, if you only need to heat treat parts occasionally, outsourcing can give you that flexibility without having to spend a ton of money on equipment that you're not going to use that often.
So it's all about matching your capabilities to your actual needs. What about the materials and processes involved? I imagine that plays a role too.
Absolutely. Are you working with pretty standard alloys and heat treatment procedures, or are you using more exotic materials that require some specialized expertise?
Right. I mean, some of our listeners are really pushing the boundaries of what's possible with metal AM, experimenting with new alloys and all that.
And that's where those outside providers can really come in handy. They often have the equipment and the know-how to deal with those trickier materials. So you don't have to go through the whole learning curve yourself.
So it's like having a specialist on call.
Cool.
But if you're working with a more limited range of materials and your heat treatment needs are pretty predictable, an in-house setup might make more sense.
Yeah, it could. Especially if you can establish a really solid and consistent internal process for those materials.
Quality assurance is another big one, especially in industries with strict requirements.
Oh, for sure. Do you absolutely need to meet certain certifications like NADCAP, or is there a little more wiggle room in your industry?
Yeah.
If those certifications are a must-have, outsourcing to a provider that already has them can make your life a lot easier.
Yeah. It definitely takes some of the pressure off knowing that you're working with somebody who already meets those standards.
Yeah.
And of course, we can't forget about turnaround time. I know that's a big deal for a lot of our listeners. How critical are those deadlines?
Yeah, turnaround time is often the deciding factor. If you need those parts heat treated and back in your hands as quickly as possible, in-house is probably the way to go, because then you don't have to worry about shipping times and scheduling conflicts with the provider.
All right, it gives you that control and flexibility to keep things moving.
Exactly. But if you have a little more breathing room in your production schedule, outsourcing could be a good option. You just have to make sure you factor in those potential delays.
Yeah. Any hiccups in the heat treatment process can throw off your whole operation. So when it comes down to actually making the decision, how do you weigh all these different factors? The article mentioned a trade-off matrix, which I thought was a pretty useful tool.
It is. It basically lays out the pros and cons of doing heat treatment in-house versus outsourcing it across a bunch of different areas. So let's go through some of those key areas.
Okay, so starting with expertise and experience, what are the main things to think about?
Well, if you decide to handle heat treatment in-house, you're going to have to either train your existing staff or hire people who have that specialized metallurgical knowledge. But with outsourcing, you get that expertise right off the bat.
So it's a question of building that knowledge internally or tapping into an existing pool of experts. What about the financial side of things?
In terms of upfront costs, in-house means a big investment in equipment. You're talking furnaces, cooling systems, testing equipment. It all adds up fast. Outsourcing keeps those initial costs down because you're just paying for a service.
But then you have those ongoing operational costs to think about too,
Right.
right?
With an in-house setup, you've got maintenance utilities, consumables, and staffing costs to worry about. Outsourcing shifts those costs to a pay-per-service model, which can be good or bad depending on how much heat treatment you're actually doing.
So it's all about finding that balance. Control's another big one, I imagine.
Definitely. When you do heat treatment in-house, you have complete control over every step of the process and every quality parameter. You can really fine-tune things to get exactly what you need.
That level of control is super important for getting consistent results and making sure everything meets your exact specifications.
But when you outsource, you're giving up some of that control. You have to trust that the provider is going to meet your standards and that they're going to protect your intellectual property.
And speaking of intellectual property, that's a big deal for a lot of our listeners who are working on innovative designs.
Absolutely. If you're handling everything in-house, you have total control over your designs and your data. But
Wow.
when you outsource, there's always some risk involved. You need to be really careful about who you choose as a partner and make sure you trust them.
So finding a trustworthy partner is key. What about scalability? That's got to be a major consideration in such a fast-moving industry.
Yeah, scalability is one area where outsourcing can really shine. When you have your own setup, your capacity is limited by the equipment you have. But outsourcing gives you a lot more flexibility to scale your production up or down as needed. So if you suddenly get a huge order, you can rely on your provider to handle that increased volume.
That gives you a lot more agility to respond to changes in the market.
Exactly. And we already talked about lead times, but it's worth mentioning again that doing things in-house can be a big advantage if you're working on tight deadlines. Outsourcing can add extra time to your production schedule, so you need to factor that in.
Time is money, as they say. And delays can have a ripple effect throughout your whole operation. The last thing the trade-off matrix mentions is customization.
Yeah, and this is another area where in-house heat treatment gives you a lot of flexibility. You can really tweak those parameters and dial things in to get the exact properties you need for your specific application.
It's all about having that control over the fine details. But with outsourcing, you might have to accept more standardized processes, which might not be ideal for every situation.
Right. So as you can see, it's a pretty complex decision. There's no easy answer.
But I think armed with this information, our listeners can start to weigh these different factors and make a more informed decision that makes sense for their business.
Absolutely. And sometimes the best approach isn't just one or the other. Sometimes it's a combination of both.
It sounds like the future of heat treating is going to look a lot different than it does today.
Yeah.
But for our listeners who are dealing with these decisions right now, what are some of the key things they should be thinking about?
I think the biggest takeaway is that there's no right answer for everybody. The best way to handle heat treatment really depends on your specific situation. You know, how many parts are you making? How complex are those parts? What kind of quality standards do you need to meet? What are your deadlines? And of course, what's your budget?
So it's all about carefully weighing all those different factors and figuring out what makes the most sense for your business.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to kind of think outside the box. The industry is changing so fast. What might have been the best approach a few years ago might not be the best approach today.
So it's important to stay up to date on all the latest technologies and trends. Any advice for our listeners on how to do that?
Well, going to industry conferences and trade shows is always a good idea. You can meet other people in the industry, see the latest and greatest technology, and hear from experts.
Yeah, those events can be really valuable for learning and networking.
For sure. And, sometimes just talking to other people can be really helpful too. Reach out to other companies in your industry, talk to equipment manufacturers or heat treatment specialists, and just pick their brains. You might be surprised at what you can learn.
It's all about building that network of knowledge and support. And I think that's a great place to wrap things up. So to all our listeners out there who are trying to figure out this whole heat treatment thing in metal AM, just remember, you're not alone. There are a lot of resources and experts out there to help you. And by staying informed, asking questions, and being open to new ideas, you can find the approach that works best for you and your business.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And as always, we're here to help you along the way, so be sure to tune in to the next deep dive for more insights and analysis.
Until then, happy printing, everyone.